January 14th, 1979. Somewhere in the frozen darkness of Queens, New York, a 28-year-old kid named Thomas DeSimone climbed into a car he should never have gotten into. It was late. It was cold. The kind of cold that bites through your coat and makes your bones ache. The kind of cold where your breath hangs in the air like smoke from a cigarette you don't even realize you're dragging on. Tommy was excited. He had been told that tonight was his night, the night he would finally become a made man in the Lucchese crime family, the night all those years of doing dirt, pulling triggers, cracking skulls, and proving his loyalty would finally pay off. He had been waiting for this moment his entire adult life. He got dressed sharp. He probably checked himself in the mirror one last time, fixed his collar, ran his hand through his hair, told himself this was it. This was the beginning of real power, real protection, real respect. He walked out of his house, and he never came back. Not that night. Not any night after that. Tommy DeSimone vanished off the face of the earth. No body was ever recovered. No funeral was ever held. No grave was ever dug. At least not one that anyone outside a very small circle of killers ever knew about. The most likely scenario, and the one that the FBI and multiple informants have confirmed over the decades, is that Tommy walked into a room expecting a ceremony and instead caught bullets to the back of his skull before he even had a chance to understand what was happening. Some accounts say he was shot twice. Some say more. Some say they strangled him first and then shot him. What everyone agrees on is that Tommy DeSimone died confused, betrayed, and alone, killed by the very world he had given everything to be part of. His body was likely wrapped in plastic, stuffed into the trunk of a car, and buried in a spot so remote that even 4 decades of FBI searches have turned up nothing. And the man who could have saved him, the man Tommy had served faithfully for years, the man Tommy called his captain, his protector, his surrogate father figure, Paul Vario, did absolutely nothing, worse than nothing. Paul Vario helped set the whole thing up. But here is what Goodfellas never showed you. Here is what Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi either did not know, chose to leave out, or deliberately softened because the truth was too ugly, too complicated, and too damning to fit neatly into a 2.5-hour movie. In the film, Tommy DeVito, played brilliantly by Joe Pesci in an Oscar-winning performance, gets whacked because he killed Billy Batts, a made member of the Gambino family. That part is true, at least partially, but the movie makes it seem like Tommy's death was purely a consequence of that one act of disrespect, that one murder in the bar. It presents Tommy's killing as a kind of mob justice, an inevitable punishment for breaking the rules. What the movie never tells you is that Paul Vario, the real Paul Vario, not the softened, almost fatherly Paul Cicero that Paul Sorvino played on screen, was a cold-blooded calculator who had been weighing Tommy's value against Tommy's liabilities for years. And by the end of 1978, the math simply did not work anymore. Tommy had become more dangerous alive than dead. And Vario, the man Tommy trusted most in this world, made the decision to let him go. Not with reluctance, not with sorrow. With the same emotional detachment you would use to cancel a subscription you no longer needed. This is the real story of Paul Vario's deadly betrayal of Tommy DeSimone, and this is the story that Goodfellas buried. To understand how deep this betrayal really goes, you have to understand who Tommy DeSimone actually was. Not the movie version, not the Joe Pesci caricature, but the real human being. Thomas DeSimone was born in 1951 in Brooklyn, New York, into a family that was already drowning in mob connections. His father, also named Thomas, was connected to organized crime. His uncle, Rosario DeSimone, was a known associate. Tommy did not stumble into the life the way Henry Hill did, wandering over from a working-class Irish-Italian neighborhood because he was dazzled by the shiny cars and the $100 handshakes. Tommy was born into this world. It was in his blood. It was the family business. By the time he was a teenager, Tommy was already running with crews in East New York and Canarsie, already doing small jobs, already building a reputation. And here is the thing nobody talks about when they discuss Tommy DeSimone. He was not the short, compact, explosive firecracker that Joe Pesci portrayed. The real Tommy was tall, over 6 feet, solidly built, physically intimidating. He was handsome, in a rough way. He could charm people when he wanted to, but underneath that charm was something genuinely terrifying. Tommy had a capacity for violence that even hardened mobsters found unsettling. He was not just willing to kill. He seemed to enjoy it. He seemed to need it the way other people need air or water or approval. And this is crucial to understanding everything that came after, because Tommy's violence was both his ticket into the inner circle and the thing that ultimately made him expendable. By his early 20s, Tommy was firmly under the wing of Paul Vario, a capo regime in the Lucchese crime family who ran a sprawling empire of loan sharking, bookmaking, hijacking, labor racketeering, and airport theft out of a storefront in Canarsie. Vario was not a flashy boss. He was not a screamer or a table pounder. He was quiet, calculating, patient, and deeply strategic. He understood that the mob was not about honor or brotherhood or any of that romantic nonsense that Hollywood loves to sell. It was about money. Period. Everything else was window dressing. Loyalty meant nothing if you were not earning. Respect meant nothing if you were a liability. Friendship meant nothing if your existence threatened the operation. Vario kept guys like Tommy around because Tommy was useful. Tommy was a weapon. When somebody needed to be scared, Tommy scared them. When somebody needed to be hurt, Tommy hurt them. When somebody needed to disappear, Tommy made them disappear. But here is what Goodfellas got completely wrong about this relationship. The movie makes it seem like Paulie genuinely cared about his crew, like there was real affection there, real paternal instinct. In the famous scene where Paul Sorvino as Paulie hugs Henry Hill after he gets out of jail, you can almost believe this is a man who loves his people. The reality was nothing like that. Paul Vario cared about Paul Vario. He cared about his money, his freedom, and his position in the Lucchese family hierarchy. Everyone else was a tool to be used, maintained when functional, and discarded when broken. And Tommy DeSimone, for all his fearlessness and ferocity, never understood this fundamental truth. He thought proximity was protection. He thought doing Vario's dirty work bought him immunity. It bought him a death sentence. Now let us talk about the Billy Bats situation, because this is where the movie and reality start to diverge in ways that matter enormously. In Goodfellas, the Billy Bats murder is presented as a spontaneous explosion of violence. Billy Bats, played by Frank Vincent, comes to the bar, makes fun of Tommy for shining shoes as a kid. Tommy snaps, beats him nearly to death, and then later, with Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke, finishes the job and buries the body. It is one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history. But here is what really happened, and here is what changes everything about how you understand Tommy's fate. The real murder of William Bentvena, known as Billy Bats, did happen at a bar. Tommy did attack him. But the provocation went deeper than a joke about shoe shining. Bats had been in prison for years and had just gotten out. He came back, expecting to reclaim his old rackets, his old territory, his old status. He was a made member of the Gambino family, which meant he had serious protection. But he also had a mouth on him and a habit of disrespecting people he considered beneath him, which in his mind included Tommy DeSimone, who was not yet made and therefore, in the eyes of the old-school mob, was essentially a nobody, regardless of how many bodies he had dropped. The tension between Bats and Tommy was not a single night affair. It had been building. And when Tommy finally snapped, he did not just beat Bats unconscious. He beat him with a level of savagery that shocked even the guys in the room who were used to violence. And then he and Jimmy Burke killed him, wrapped his body up, and transported it. The body was initially buried, then had to be moved when the burial site was threatened by construction, a detail the movie actually kept fairly accurate. But here is what Goodfellas glossed over entirely. The Billy Bats murder did not just violate mob protocol because Bats was a made man. It violated the foundational agreement between the 5 families of New York. A made member of the Gambino family had been killed without authorization, without a sit-down, without permission from the Gambino leadership. This was not just a rules violation. This was an act of war. And the moment it happened, a clock started ticking. The Gambino family, under first Carlo Gambino and then Paul Castellano, was going to demand blood for blood. It was not a question of if, it was a question of when. And Paul Vario knew this. He knew it the moment he found out what Tommy had done. He knew that the Gambinos would eventually identify Tommy as the killer, and when they did, they would demand his life. And here is the part that makes your stomach turn. Vario did not immediately try to protect Tommy. He did not go to the Lucchese boss and try to make a case for sparing him. What Vario did, what the evidence suggests, and what Henry Hill later confirmed, was simply wait. He let Tommy keep working, keep earning, keep being useful, while the clock ticked down. He squeezed every last drop of value out of Tommy DeSimone, knowing full well that Tommy was already dead. He just had not been told yet. Think about that. Imagine going to work every day, risking your freedom and your life, handing your earnings up to a man who has already agreed to let you be murdered. That is not betrayal in the heat of the moment. That is cold, calculated, sustained betrayal over months and possibly years. And Vario did not lose a single night of sleep over it. Now we need to talk about the other killings, because Tommy DeSimone did not just kill Billy Bats. He killed multiple people, and each one of those killings added weight to the case against him and gave Vario more reason to cut him loose. There was the murder of Teresa Ferrara, a young woman connected to the crew who Tommy allegedly killed because she knew too much about various criminal activities. There was the killing that inspired the spider scene in Goodfellas, where Tommy shoots a young bar worker in the foot during a card game and then later kills him for talking back. In the movie, this is played for dark comedy, with Tommy as the unhinged wild card and Spider as the unfortunate victim of mob cruelty. But in reality, the victim was a real person named Michael Spider Gianco, and his death was not a punchline. It was a tragedy that further demonstrated Tommy's complete inability to control his violent impulses. Every time Tommy killed someone, he created a new problem, a new body, a new potential investigation, a new set of witnesses to manage or eliminate, a new reason for law enforcement to look more closely at Vario's crew. And each of these problems landed on Paul Vario's desk, because Vario was the captain, the guy who had to keep things running smoothly, the guy who had to answer to the Lucchese family leadership when things got messy. Tommy was generating more mess than money, and in the mob, that equation only ends one way. Let us also talk about something the movie barely touches on, which is Tommy's relationship with Jimmy Burke, the real-life version of Jimmy Conway, played by Robert De Niro. In Goodfellas, Jimmy and Tommy are presented as close friends, almost brothers, with Jimmy as the older, more strategic one, and Tommy as the volatile, younger partner. And there is some truth to that. Jimmy and Tommy were tight. They worked together on scores. They committed crimes together. They trusted each other in the foxhole. But Jimmy Burke was also a survivor, maybe the greatest survivor in the history of the New York mob. Jimmy understood something that Tommy never could, which is that the mob does not reward passion or courage or even loyalty. It rewards usefulness. And the moment you become more useful dead than alive, you are already a ghost. You just have not stopped breathing yet. When the Lufthansa heist went down in December of 1978, just weeks before Tommy was killed, everything changed. The Lufthansa heist was the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. Nearly $6 million stolen from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. Jimmy Burke was the mastermind. Tommy DeSimone was one of the crew, and the heist was a triumph of planning and execution, pulled off with military precision. But the aftermath was a catastrophe, and the aftermath is where Tommy's fate was sealed. Here is what you have to understand about the Lufthansa heist and how it connects to Tommy's murder. After the score, Jimmy Burke became intensely paranoid. The FBI was all over it. Surveillance was everywhere. Informants were being cultivated. And the crew members who had participated in the heist were the biggest liability imaginable. Each one of them knew enough to put Jimmy away for life. Each one of them was a potential witness, a potential rat, a potential loose end. And Jimmy Burke started eliminating those loose ends with terrifying efficiency. In the weeks and months after Lufthansa, bodies started turning up all over New York. Stax Edwards, real name Parnell Edwards, was murdered. His wife was murdered. Angelo Sepe was murdered. Frenchie McMahon, Joe Buddha Manry, Robert McMahon. The list kept growing. Jimmy was systematically wiping out everyone connected to the heist. And Tommy was on that list too. But Tommy's situation was more complicated because Tommy had the Billy Bats problem hanging over his head simultaneously. So when the order finally came down to kill Tommy, it came from multiple directions at once. The Gambino family wanted him dead for Bats. Jimmy may have wanted him dead as a Lufthansa loose end. And Paul Vario, the man who should have been Tommy's shield, simply stepped aside and let it happen. Some accounts suggest Vario did more than step aside. Some accounts suggest he actively participated in luring Tommy to his death by telling him the made man ceremony was real, by assuring Tommy that he had been approved, by feeding Tommy the lie that his dreams were about to come true, when in reality, Tommy was walking into an execution chamber. Think about the psychological cruelty of that for a second. Think about what it takes to look a man in the eye, a man who has killed for you, stolen for you, gone to prison for you, a man who trusts you with his life, and tell him that he is about to receive the greatest honor of his criminal career, knowing full well that he is about to receive bullets instead. That is not just betrayal. That is something darker than betrayal. That is a level of human coldness that most people cannot even comprehend. And Paul Vario did it without blinking. He did it because it solved multiple problems at once. Tommy's death satisfied the Gambino family's demand for justice. Tommy's death eliminated a potential Lufthansa witness. Tommy's death removed a volatile, unpredictable element from Vario's crew. And Tommy's death sent a message to everyone else in the organization. A message that said, your service means nothing. Your loyalty means nothing. Your willingness to kill and die means nothing if the math does not work in your favor. You are a number on a ledger sheet, and when your column turns red, you get erased. The movie Goodfellas handles Tommy's death in one of the most powerful scenes in film history. Joe Pesci walks into a room expecting his making ceremony. The room is empty. He realizes what is happening. He says the words, "Oh no," and he is shot in the back of the head. It is devastating, and it is effective, and Scorsese deserves every bit of praise he has received for that sequence. But the movie presents this moment in isolation, as a consequence specifically of the Billy Batts murder, as if Tommy's death was simply the inevitable result of breaking one rule. The reality is so much more layered than that. Tommy's death was not punishment for a single crime. It was the result of a calculation that had been running for years. Paul Vario had been weighing Tommy's value against Tommy's cost since the mid-1970s, and by the end of '78, the spreadsheet was clear. Tommy cost more than he earned. Tommy created more problems than he solved. Tommy's continued existence threatened Vario's relationship with the Gambino family, Vario's freedom from FBI scrutiny, and Vario's position within the Lucchese family hierarchy. So Tommy had to go. And the making ceremony story was just the bait on the hook. There is another dimension to this betrayal that almost nobody discusses, and it goes to the heart of what the American mafia really was, versus what the movies tell you it was. Tommy DeSimone was not eligible to be made. He knew it, Vario knew it, everyone knew it. To be made in the Italian-American mafia, you had to be fully Italian on both sides of your family. Tommy's mother was reportedly not fully Italian, which technically disqualified him. Some accounts dispute this, and some suggest that exceptions could have been made given Tommy's track record and connections. But the point is that the question of Tommy's eligibility was itself a source of tension and insecurity for Tommy his entire career. He was doing made-man work without made-man protection. He was killing for the family without being officially part of the family. He was taking all the risks with none of the institutional safeguards. And Vario exploited this insecurity ruthlessly. He kept Tommy motivated by dangling the possibility of being made, by suggesting that if Tommy just did one more thing, proved himself one more time, handled one more problem, the ceremony would come. It was the mob equivalent of stringing along an employee with promises of a promotion that is never going to happen. Except in this version, the employee does not just get passed over. He gets killed. Vario used the dream of being made as a leash, a way to control Tommy, to keep him obedient, to keep him hungry, to keep him working. And then, in the cruelest possible twist, he used that same dream as the murder weapon. He dangled the ceremony one final time, and Tommy, blinded by his lifelong desire for acceptance and respect, took the bait without hesitation. You also have to understand the role that Henry Hill played in all of this, and how the movie sanitizes Henry's complicity. In Goodfellas, Henry Hill is the narrator, the protagonist, the guy we sympathize with. Ray Liotta plays him as a charming rogue who got in over his head. And while the movie does show Henry's descent into drug addiction and paranoia, it never really forces the audience to reckon with the fact that Henry knew what was going to happen to Tommy and did nothing to warn him. Henry Hill and Tommy DeSimone were supposed to be friends. They grew up together. They committed crimes together. They were as close as two guys in that world could be. But when the order came down for Tommy, Henry did not pick up the phone. Henry did not pull Tommy aside and say, "Hey, something does not feel right. Maybe skip the ceremony tonight." Henry kept his mouth shut because Henry understood the same thing Vario understood, which is that in the mob, you do not stick your neck out for a dead man. And Tommy was already dead. He was dead the moment he killed Billy Batts. Everything between that night and the night of his murder was just borrowed time. Henry Hill later told FBI agents and journalists that he was genuinely surprised by Tommy's death, that he did not see it coming. But multiple other sources, including other informants and FBI analysis of the timeline, suggest that Henry had at least some awareness that Tommy was in danger. Whether Henry actively participated in the setup or simply failed to intervene, the result was the same. Another layer of betrayal wrapped around Tommy like a burial shroud. Now here is something that drives me crazy about the way the Goodfellas mythology has shaped public understanding of these events. The movie makes you feel something when Tommy dies. It is shocking. It is sad. Joe Pesci's performance makes you care about this psychopathic killer in a way that probably should not be possible. But the movie never asks you to sit with the larger implications of Tommy's death. It never asks you to think about the system that produced Tommy, used Tommy, and destroyed Tommy. Because Tommy DeSimone was not an anomaly. He was a product. The mob needed guys like Tommy. It needed young men who were willing to do terrible things for the promise of belonging, for the promise of power, for the promise of a seat at the table that was never going to be offered. The mob recruited these men from neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities were scarce, where violence was already normalized, where the only successful people you saw were the guys with the Cadillacs and the thick rolls of cash. The mob took boys like Tommy DeSimone and turned them into weapons, and then when those weapons became inconvenient, the mob discarded them like empty shell casings. And Paul Vario was the embodiment of this system. He did not feel guilty about sacrificing Tommy because in Vario's mind, Tommy was never a person. Tommy was a function, and functions do not have funerals. After Tommy's death, life went on for Paul Vario as if nothing had happened. The Lucchese family continued its operations. The Gambino family was satisfied that blood had been paid for blood. The Lufthansa investigation continued to grind forward, but without Tommy as a potential weak link, one more vulnerability had been eliminated. Vario continued to run his crew from Canarsie, continued to collect his tribute, continued to live the life of a mid-level mob boss with a nice house, a girlfriend on the side, and the quiet confidence of a man who had navigated a crisis successfully. Meanwhile, Tommy DeSimone's family was left with nothing. No body to bury, no explanation, no closure. Just a void where a person used to be. In the mob, when a man gets killed and his body is hidden, the family is not told what happened. They are left to wonder, to hope, to gradually accept the obvious truth that everyone else already knows. Tommy's mother, his siblings, they all had to live with that silence. And Paul Vario, the man who could have given them answers, who could have at least had the decency to let them know their son and brother was dead, said nothing. Because saying something would have meant admitting something, and admitting something would have created risk, and risk was the only thing Paul Vario truly feared. The irony, the deep, bitter, almost poetic irony of this whole story is that Paul Vario himself eventually fell. Not to a bullet, not to a rival family, to the one thing he should have managed better, but did not. Henry Hill became a federal informant in 1980, less than 2 years after Tommy's murder. Henry flipped because he was facing drug charges and because he knew that Jimmy Burke was killing off everyone connected to Lufthansa, and Henry correctly calculated that he was next on the list. When Henry went to the FBI, he brought with him a lifetime of knowledge about Paul Vario's operations. He gave them everything: the hijackings, the loan sharking, the bookmaking, the labor racketeering, the airport thefts, the murders. Henry Hill's testimony led to Paul Vario's conviction on racketeering charges. Vario was sentenced to prison, where he died on May 3, 1988, of respiratory failure. He was 73 years old. He died in a federal prison cell, far from his crew, far from his power, far from everything he had spent his life building. And the guy who put him there was the same guy Vario had once trusted enough to bring into his inner circle. The same guy who had watched Tommy DeSimone get set up and said nothing. The mob eats its own. It always has. It always will. That is not a movie tagline. That is a historical fact, proven over and over and over again. From the Castellamarese War, to Valachi, to Gravano, to Hill, the pattern never changes. The only question is who gets eaten first. What makes Paul Vario's betrayal of Tommy DeSimone so significant, so worthy of examination decades later, is that it strips away every romantic illusion the movies have ever sold about the mob. There was no honor. There was no code. There was no brotherhood. There was a man who used another man until the using was done. And then there was a body in a hole, somewhere in New Jersey or Staten Island or wherever Tommy ended up. And the system that made this possible, the hierarchy of bosses and underbosses and capos and soldiers and associates, was specifically designed to make betrayals like this not only possible, but inevitable. The whole structure of the American mafia was built on the principle that the guys at the bottom are disposable. They do the dangerous work. They take the biggest risks. They face the longest prison sentences, and they receive the smallest percentage of the profits. Meanwhile, the guys at the top, guys like Vario, sit back, collect their tribute, and make cold decisions about who lives and who dies based on nothing but self-interest. Tommy DeSimone never had a chance. Not really. From the moment he was born into that world, his trajectory was set. He was going to do violent things for powerful people. And then those powerful people were going to decide he had outlived his usefulness. And then he was going to disappear. The only variable was timing. And in January of 1979, the timing ran out. I want to leave you with this thought. In Goodfellas, after Tommy is killed, Henry Hill narrates a line about how Tommy was always a wild card, always unpredictable, always dangerous. And the movie subtly invites you to see Tommy's death as, if not justified, then at least understandable within the logic of the mob. He broke the rules, so he paid the price. But that framing lets Paul Vario off the hook. It lets the entire Lucchese family off the hook. It lets a system designed to exploit and discard young men off the hook. Because the truth is that Tommy DeSimone did not just break the rules. The rules broke Tommy DeSimone. The same mob culture that rewarded violence, that celebrated killers, that promoted men based on their willingness to pull triggers and bury bodies. That same culture turned around and killed Tommy for doing exactly what it trained him to do. Paul Vario did not just betray one man. He exemplified a system of betrayal so complete, so embedded in the structure of organized crime, that the men inside it could not even see it for what it was until it was too late. Tommy thought he was earning his way to the top. He was actually digging his own grave. One murder at a time, one favor at a time, one act of loyalty at a time. And Paul Vario handed him the shovel with a smile and a promise that the ceremony was coming soon. The ceremony never came. Just the bullet. That is the real story of Tommy DeSimone. Not the movie version. Not the myth. The cold, ugly, irreversible truth. If this story opened your eyes to what the mob really was behind the Hollywood glamour, hit that subscribe button right now. We drop a new mob documentary every single week, digging into the stories that the movies buried, the truths that the made men tried to take to their graves, and the betrayals that history almost forgot. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Was Tommy DeSimone doomed from birth, or could he have survived if he had played it smarter? And what story should we cover next? This is Goodfellas Never Exposed, Paul Vario's deadly betrayal of Tommy DeSimone, untold stories from organized crime. Until next time.